I mean, it's just junk, Mom. Pure, unadulterated junk. Why are you holding on to all that old stuff?
It was important to me. I think it's time we discuss things properly. Oh, do we? After all these years?
What is that boy doing?
What's in the box? Please, just let me explain. I trusted you.
Mom, I didn't mean to.
But you did. And now, you need to fix this.
You know what's funny? My son Brandon said, as everyone settled around the Christmas dinner table. Mom has been paying nearly $300 a month to store 30 years of junk. The room filled with laughter. Seriously, he continued, shaking his head. When she's finally ready, we'll haul it all to the dump. I smiled, took a slow sip of tea, and waited for the laughter to fade. Then I looked at my 15-year-old grandson. Lucas, sweetheart, would you bring in box 1 from my car? He returned, carrying a weathered cardboard box, setting it carefully in the center of the table. Every smile disappeared. I rested my hand on the lid and looked directly at my son. If you're certain my storage unit only holds junk, I said softly, let's see what's inside the very first box. Brandon's face lost its color before I even touched the tape. If this story moves you, I'd love for you to stay with me until the end. Please like this video, subscribe if you enjoy heartfelt family stories, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done if someone called your life's memories junk? And before you go, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Not the antique collection Charles and I had spent decades building. Not even the little appraisal business that had quietly earned us a comfortable retirement. It would have been my family. I believed, perhaps too stubbornly, that love was stronger than money. I believed that children who had grown up surrounded by honesty would naturally choose honesty themselves. Life has a way of testing the things we believe most deeply. I retired at 65, almost a year before Charles passed away. We had owned Ashford Antique Appraisals in Columbus, Ohio, for over 30 years. We weren't famous television experts or wealthy collectors, with mansions filled with priceless paintings. We were simply two people who loved history. Charles used to say that every object deserved respect because someone somewhere had once loved it enough to keep it. A cracked porcelain bowl wasn't just a bowl, it was Sunday dinners. A faded military medal wasn't made of bronze, it was sacrifice. An old photograph wasn't paper, it was proof that someone had once laughed beneath the same sky we now stood under. People brought us everything imaginable: Civil War letters, Victorian jewelry, old farm tools, handmade quilts, children's toys. Sometimes the items were valuable, most of the time they weren't. But Charles never treated inexpensive pieces differently from expensive ones. The market decides price, he often told our clients, but families decide value. Those words stayed with me long after he was gone. Our son Brandon grew up around antiques, though he never shared our passion. As a little boy, he preferred baseball over estate sales and bicycles over museums. Charles never forced him to love what we loved. You don't have to collect history, he would tell Brandon. Just don't forget it. When Brandon graduated from college, he surprised us all by choosing finance. He was brilliant with numbers, ambitious, and determined to build a life very different from ours. I was proud of him. Charles was proud of him. By 42, Brandon had become a successful financial advisor. He and his wife Rachel owned a beautiful home in one of Columbus's newer neighborhoods. Their son Lucas had just started high school and somehow managed to inherit Charles's quiet curiosity instead of Brandon's constant urgency. Lucas could spend an hour listening to stories behind an old pocket watch. Brandon couldn't spend 5 minutes looking at one. After Charles died, everything changed so gradually that I almost missed it. Grief has a strange way of blurring time. The funeral came and went. Friends returned to their lives. Sympathy cards stopped arriving. Phone calls became less frequent. The house that had always echoed with Charles's humming suddenly became unbearably silent. I kept expecting to hear him in the workshop polishing brass or cataloging another collection. Instead, there was only the ticking of the grandfather clock. During those first few months, Brandon visited often. At first, I appreciated it. He fixed loose cabinet doors. He changed light bulbs. He insisted on mowing my lawn even though I was perfectly capable of doing it myself. "I just want to help Mom," he would say. And I believed him. Then the conversation slowly shifted. "Have you thought about selling some of Dad's things? You don't really need all those old records. The storage unit is costing you money every month. I could help organize everything." The suggestions sounded reasonable, even thoughtful, but they never stopped. Every visit eventually circled back to the storage unit. $300 every month, Brandon would remind me while sipping coffee at my kitchen table. "That's $3,600 a year." "I know what it costs," I answered one afternoon. "You could take a vacation with that money." "I don't need a vacation." "You could invest it." "I've already invested." "In what?" I smiled gently. "In patience." He laughed as though I had made a joke. I hadn't. The storage unit wasn't an impulse. It wasn't a forgotten collection of dusty furniture. Charles and I had rented it almost 15 years earlier, when our appraisal business began overflowing with family archives, business records, heirlooms, and collections that couldn't safely remain in our home. Everything inside had been cataloged. Everything. Charles labeled every box by hand. Neat black marker. Simple numbers. Nothing more. No descriptions. No inventory attached to the outside. Just numbers. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Years later, I realized he had been preparing for something I couldn't yet understand. Brandon didn't know what was inside any of the boxes. Neither did Rachel. No one did. Because Charles had insisted that only the two of us keep the master inventory. "It's not about secrecy," he once explained while locking the storage unit. "It's about responsibility." "What responsibility?" I asked. He smiled in that quiet way he always had whenever he knew something I didn't. "The responsibility to make sure people see what's truly valuable before they decide what something is worth." I laughed then. Now those words echoed inside my mind almost every day. Rachel eventually joined Brandon in encouraging me to empty the unit. She never sounded cruel, just practical. "Marlene," she said one afternoon over lunch, "you deserve less stress at this stage of life." "I don't feel stressed." "You don't need hundreds of old boxes." "I don't own hundreds." She smiled politely. "You know what I mean." "No," I answered. "Actually, I don't." She looked uncomfortable. "I just think sometimes people hold on because they're afraid to let go." That sentence stayed with me for weeks. Was I holding on? Or was I protecting something? Even I wasn't entirely sure anymore. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. Brandon arrived unexpectedly carrying coffee from my favorite cafe. We sat on the porch overlooking my small backyard. After nearly half an hour of ordinary conversation, he casually asked, "Mom, how many numbered boxes are actually left in storage?" The question itself wasn't unusual. The way he asked it was. He wasn't curious. He was calculating. I noticed because I had spent more than 30 years reading faces across appraisal tables. Collectors always had the same expression when they believed they had discovered something valuable before anyone else. Brandon wore that exact expression. I answered carefully. "Enough," he chuckled. "I mean, are there 10, 20? I've honestly never counted." "Really?" "No." That wasn't entirely true. I knew the exact number. Every single box, every shelf, every lock, every notebook. But for the first time in my life, I lied to my own son. His disappointment lasted only a fraction of a second before he smiled again. Yet something inside me quietly shifted. For the first time since Charles's death, I began wondering whether Brandon wanted to help me, or whether he wanted what he believed was hidden inside a room he had never actually seen. That evening, after he drove away, I stood alone in my living room, staring at the framed photograph of Charles smiling beside one of our earliest antique displays. "I think you saw this coming," I whispered. The photograph, of course, offered no answer. But somehow, I felt as though he already had. The first time I truly questioned my son, I hated myself for it. No mother wants to believe that suspicion belongs in the same room as her child. For weeks after our conversation on the porch, I kept telling myself I was overthinking everything. Brandon had just lost his father. Grief changes people. Stress changes people. Running a successful financial planning business meant he naturally looked at life through numbers. Perhaps every suggestion about the storage unit was simply practical advice from a man who wanted his widowed mother to simplify her life. That explanation comforted me. Until it didn't. The first crack appeared on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was sorting through mail when my phone rang. Mrs. Ashford, speaking. This is Sandra from Buckeye Secure Storage. I'm just confirming that your emergency contact information is still current. It should be. We're updating our files. Of course, she paused. I noticed there was an inquiry about your unit a few weeks ago. I wanted to make sure it came from someone you authorized. I frowned. What kind of inquiry? Someone called asking whether the leaseholder could be changed if the owner became unable to manage the account. A strange chill crept across my shoulders. Did they identify themselves? No, ma'am. We don't discuss customer information without verification. What did you tell them? The same thing we tell everyone. We don't release access or ownership without proper documentation. I thanked her and hung up. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Yet I couldn't stop staring at the kitchen wall after the call ended. Someone had asked about transferring control of my storage unit. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe it wasn't. I refused to jump to conclusions. Still, I drove to the storage facility that afternoon. The building sat on the outskirts of Columbus, near an industrial park, quiet, except for the occasional delivery truck passing along the highway. Charles had chosen the location because it offered climate-controlled units and excellent security. History deserves dry walls, he'd joked when we signed the lease. Sandra greeted me with a warm smile. It's nice to finally meet you in person again, Mrs. Ashford. I hope I'm not causing trouble. Not at all. I hesitated before asking, about that phone call. She nodded knowingly. I figured that's why you came. Can you tell me anything? Not much. She lowered her voice. The caller knew your last name. My stomach tightened. They also knew your unit number. That detail unsettled me more than I expected. Unit numbers weren't public information. Very few people even knew we rented storage. Did the caller give a name? Sandra shook her head. They hung up once we explained our policy. I thanked her again and walked slowly toward my unit. The long hallway smelled faintly of concrete and cardboard. Thousands of lives were stored behind those metal doors. Wedding dresses, old furniture, business inventory, childhood memories. Every locked space contained pieces of someone's past. Mine held something else. Charles's life work. I unlocked the heavy door. The fluorescent lights flickered on. Everything stood exactly where we had left it. Tall shelving units lined both walls. Each shelf held carefully labeled cardboard boxes. Simple black numbers, nothing more. Charles had always insisted labels should never advertise contents. The fewer assumptions people make, he'd often say, the safer the truth becomes. I walked slowly down the aisle. My fingertips brushed the dusty edges of box 3. Then box 4. Everything appeared untouched. Until I reached the back corner. I stopped. Something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just different. Charles used identical brass padlocks throughout the unit. I remembered buying them together. He had joked that matching locks made him irrationally happy, yet the lock securing one rear storage cabinet looked newer, not shiny, just newer. Most people would never notice. I did. Years of examining antiques had trained my eyes to recognize the smallest inconsistency. I crouched beside it. Tiny scratches surrounded the latch. The metal wasn't damaged, but someone had removed it at some point. Long ago. Not recently. My heartbeat quickened. Had Charles replaced it? Had I simply forgotten memory plays cruel tricks after loss? I wasn't certain anymore. Before leaving, I asked Sandra another question. Do you keep old maintenance records? Usually. Even from several years ago. She thought for a moment. Sometimes. She disappeared into the office. 10 minutes later, she returned holding a thin folder. We had a security issue about 4 years ago. What happened? Someone accidentally cut the wrong lock. I looked up. The wrong lock. They hired a locksmith for another customer who had lost keys. She pointed toward a maintenance report. The technician mistakenly opened the neighboring cabinet before realizing the unit numbers had been misread. My pulse slowed. So nothing was stolen. No. The cabinet was immediately resealed with a replacement lock. I stared at the paperwork. The cabinet listed wasn't the main storage unit. It was the rear locking cabinet inside my rented space, the one Charles had always kept separate. Sandra smiled apologetically. We replaced the lock at no cost. I don't remember receiving a call. It was handled through your husband. 4 years ago. Charles had still been alive. He had never mentioned it. Why? On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about that replacement lock. Charles told me almost everything. Almost. What had been inside that cabinet, and why hadn't he considered the incident important enough to mention? That evening, I climbed into the attic searching through old business files. 3 hours later, I found one of Charles's notebooks. It wasn't the notebook I had hoped to find, but inside, tucked between appraisal records, I discovered a handwritten note. Only one sentence. If anyone ever reaches the cabinet first, they'll still be looking in the wrong place. I read it 3 times, then a fourth. There was no explanation, no date, no signature. Only those words written in Charles's unmistakable handwriting. I laughed despite the growing unease. Still giving me riddles, I whispered. Charles had loved puzzles. Every anniversary he created elaborate treasure hunts instead of buying expensive gifts. Sometimes I had to solve 6 clues before finding a necklace hidden inside a cereal box. He believed people appreciated discoveries more when they earned them. Was this another puzzle? Or was he trying to tell me something important? That night, I barely slept. The following morning, Brandon called. Morning, Mom. Good morning. What are you up to today? Oh, just organizing paperwork. Anything interesting? His question sounded casual, too casual. I answered carefully. Mostly old business files. I keep telling you you should let me help sort through all that. I know. We could spend a weekend clearing everything out. I looked at the notebook lying open beside my coffee mug. No, I said gently. I think I'll take my time. A brief silence followed. Then Brandon laughed. You've always been the patient one. Your father was even more patient. I guess that's true. When the conversation ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. For the first time, I stopped asking myself whether Brandon wanted something hidden inside the storage unit. Instead, I began asking a far more unsettling question. How did my son know enough to keep asking about the very place Charles had gone to such extraordinary lengths to protect? Once doubt enters your heart, it has a terrible habit of making you notice everything you previously ignored. For the next several weeks, I found myself replaying old conversations with Brandon in my mind. Remarks that had once sounded caring now carried a different weight. How much longer do you plan on paying for that storage unit? Do you even remember what's inside every box? Wouldn't Dad have wanted you to simplify things? At the time, I had answered each question patiently. Now I wondered why every conversation eventually returned to the same subject, the storage unit. It was almost as though nothing else mattered. I hated myself for thinking that way. Brandon was my son. I had held him the day he was born. I had kissed scraped knees, stayed awake through childhood fevers, driven him to baseball practice, celebrated every graduation, and cried quietly during his wedding ceremony, because I couldn't believe the little boy who once collected toy dinosaurs was becoming someone's husband. You don't simply stop believing in your child, even when the evidence begins whispering. You fight those whispers. I certainly did. A week after discovering Charles's note about the rear cabinet, I drove back to Buckeye Secure Storage. Not because I planned to uncover some dramatic secret. I simply wanted to look at the unit again with fresh eyes. Sometimes Charles noticed details I overlooked. Perhaps I had missed something obvious. Sandra smiled when she saw me. Back again. I'm afraid so, she laughed softly. My grandmother used to say storage units have a way of calling people back. I think she may have been right. After signing the visitor log, I walked down the familiar hallway. The metal door rolled upward with its usual groan. Cool air greeted me. Nothing had changed, or so it appeared. I stood quietly in the center of the unit. Charles had always arranged everything with military precision. Shelves were evenly spaced. Boxes faced the same direction. Labels aligned perfectly. Even the narrow walking aisle measured exactly 3 feet wide, because according to Charles, organization should leave room to breathe. I smiled despite myself. His voice still lived inside this room. I slowly walked toward the rear cabinet again. This time I didn't focus on the lock. Instead, I studied the shelves surrounding it. Then I noticed something peculiar. Boxes 1 through 12 sat on the left side. Boxes 13 through 24 occupied the right. Perfectly symmetrical. Except, box 5 looked slightly different. Not the box itself, its position. Every box rested flush against the back edge of its shelf. Box 5 sat perhaps half an inch farther forward. Most people would never notice. Charles absolutely would have. I carefully lifted it. It wasn't unusually heavy. After setting it on a nearby table, I examined the shelf beneath. Nothing. No hidden compartment, no envelope, no secret latch. I almost laughed at myself. Grief had turned me into someone searching for mysteries inside ordinary furniture. Still, when I placed box 5 back, I pushed it all the way against the wall. Immediately something looked wrong. Very wrong. I stepped back. The entire shelf suddenly appeared uneven. Charles would never have arranged it that way. I pulled the box forward again, exactly half an inch. Now everything lined up visually. I frowned. He had positioned it deliberately. Why I examined the side panel. Nothing. The bottom. Nothing. Finally, I turned the box around. Written in tiny pencil marks, almost invisible against the cardboard, were 2 letters. RC. Not initials I recognized. Or perhaps, not initials at all. I took a photograph before carefully returning everything exactly as I had found it. On the drive home, I kept thinking about those tiny letters. RC Room Code Rear Cabinet Reference Copy. Charles loved abbreviations only he understood. It often drove me crazy. That evening, I pulled dozens of old notebooks from the attic. Most contained appraisal reports, estate inventories, auction receipts. Hours passed before I finally found another notebook from roughly the same period. I flipped through page after page, then stopped. Near the bottom of one page, Charles had written RC equals remember context. I blinked. Remember context. Beneath it, another sentence. Objects separated from their stories become merchandise. I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like him. To Charles, history meant nothing without the people behind it. He had spent his entire career reminding clients that provenance the story. Proving where something came from often mattered as much as the object itself. Perhaps those letters weren't hiding a treasure. Perhaps they were reminding me of a philosophy. Still, why write them only behind box 5? The mystery refused to leave me alone. 2 days later, I received another unexpected visitor. Daniel Foster, Charles's attorney. We had known each other for over 35 years. He never called first. He simply appeared with a pile of folder or legal documents that somehow always seemed less intimidating because he wore suspenders and smiled like everyone's favorite grandfather. This afternoon he carried coffee. I figured you might need company. I usually do. We sat on my back porch overlooking the maple tree Charles planted the year Brandon started kindergarten. Daniel remained unusually quiet. Finally, he asked, "Have you been to the storage unit recently?" I looked at him carefully. "Why would you ask that?" I knew Charles. "So did I." He chuckled. "No, you loved Charles. I negotiated contracts with Charles. What's the difference? You assumed he told you everything." Daniel smiled kindly. I knew he never did. I couldn't help laughing. "That's true." He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. "He left me instructions." I felt my heartbeat quicken. "What kind of instructions?" "They're not to be opened yet." "Then why mention them?" "Because he also instructed me to pay attention." To what? To whether anyone became unusually interested in the storage unit. The words settled heavily between us. I looked away toward the backyard. You think Brandon is interested? Daniel answered carefully. I think Charles believed someone eventually would be. Did he say Brandon? No. Anyone else? No. So this could all be coincidence. It could. Daniel wasn't a dramatic man. He never exaggerated. He never rushed to conclusions. That was exactly why his caution frightened me. I found one of Charles's notes, I admitted. Which one? If anyone reaches the cabinet first, they'll still be looking in the wrong place. Daniel nodded slowly. He really did write that. You've seen it. Years ago. What did it mean? I honestly don't know. You never asked. I did. What did he say? Daniel smiled at the memory. He told me, the answer won't matter until someone starts asking the wrong questions. I rubbed my forehead. He talked in riddles until the very end. He certainly did. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel looked directly at me. Marlene. Yes. Has Brandon asked for inventory lists? I hesitated. A few times. Specific box numbers. I thought back. Yes. Which ones? 1, 2. I paused. And 5. Daniel's expression changed so subtly that someone else might have missed it. I didn't. You recognize those numbers. He looked toward the maple tree before answering. I recognize the order. What order? I'm sorry. You can't tell me. I promised Charles. Frustration rose inside me. I'm his wife. And you were the person he trusted most. Daniel's voice softened. Which is exactly why he wanted you to discover certain things yourself. I sighed. I don't enjoy puzzles. No. He smiled gently. But Charles believed truth lasts longer when people uncover it, instead of having it handed to them. After Daniel left, I sat alone until sunset. The winter air had turned sharp and tiny flakes of snow drifted through the yard. Inside the house, I looked at the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Christmas was less than a month away. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, a quiet certainty settled over me. Whatever Charles had been preparing, whatever Brandon believed he would eventually find, whatever those numbered boxes truly represented, the answers were coming. And somehow, I knew they would arrive around the same table where my family gathered every Christmas. I have often wondered whether Charles knew the exact day our family would begin unraveling, or whether he simply understood human nature well enough to prepare for it. He was never cynical. That is something I want to make clear. My husband believed people were fundamentally good. He trusted strangers with remarkable ease and could spend an hour talking with someone at a flea market about a rusted coffee grinder, as if they had known each other for years. But he also believed that grief and money could awaken parts of a person that neither they nor their family had ever seen before. People don't become different overnight, he once told me. Pressure simply reveals who they've been slowly becoming. At the time, I thought he was talking about clients arguing over inheritances. I never imagined he might someday be talking about us. 2 mornings after Daniel's visit, I climbed into the attic again. If Charles had left more clues, I intended to find them. Not because I wanted hidden treasure, but because I wanted to understand the man I had shared 43 years of marriage with. The attic smelled exactly as it always had: cedar old paper and the faint scent of machine oil from tools Charles had stored decades earlier. Everything was organized. Of course it was. Every filing cabinet carried typed labels. Every shelf had dates. Every notebook had matching indexes. Friends used to tease him that if the government ever needed to archive history, they should simply hand Charles the keys. After nearly an hour of searching, I found a weathered leather journal tucked inside a wooden toolbox I hadn't opened since his funeral. Unlike his business notebooks, this one had no label, only a small brass clasp. Inside were handwritten entries spanning nearly 10 years. Some pages described antique discoveries, others recorded family vacations. There were sketches of furniture restorations, pressed maple leaves from camping trips, and even recipes he had copied from his grandmother. Reading it felt less like opening a journal and more like hearing his voice again. I smiled through tears. One entry stopped me cold. It was dated almost 6 years earlier. Today, Marlene asked why I insist on numbering boxes instead of labeling them. I told her organization was easier this way. That wasn't the real answer. I leaned closer. Objects create arguments. Stories create understanding. Someday, someone may search for valuables without realizing the greatest inheritance has never been hidden inside the expensive pieces. I swallowed hard. Further down the page, he had drawn a rough diagram of the storage unit. The shelves, the walking aisle, the rear cabinet. Every box was represented by a number. But instead of writing descriptions beside them, Charles had written single words: memory, service, faith, work, promise, courage, home, legacy. None of those words sounded like inventories. They sounded like chapters. I turned another page. There, in larger handwriting, Charles had written something that made my eyes fill with tears. If Marlene is reading this alone, then I wasn't given enough time. If she's reading this with our family, then perhaps I was. I reached out instinctively, running my fingers across the faded ink, as though I could somehow touch his hand again. "You always knew how to make me cry," I whispered. The following pages explained more than I had expected. Years earlier, Charles had become worried after helping settle several bitter estate disputes. He described siblings who hadn't spoken in decades fighting over furniture, children suing parents' estates, grandchildren selling family heirlooms within days of inheriting them. Again and again he wrote the same conclusion. The arguments never began with money. Money only exposed what love had stopped protecting. Near the middle of the journal, another paragraph caught my attention. "I have decided every numbered box must tell part of our family's story. They should never be opened because someone hopes to become richer. They should be opened because someone wishes to become wiser." That sentence lingered in my mind long after I finished reading it. Charles hadn't built a storage unit. I had built a time capsule. Every box had a purpose. Every number belonged to a larger story. Then I found an envelope folded neatly into the back cover. Across the front, in his unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words: "For Marlene only." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "My darling," it began. "If this letter has reached you, then I suspect you're trying to understand why I spent so much time arranging those boxes." A small laugh escaped me. Even after death, he knew me perfectly. "I never wanted you to carry this responsibility alone. But I also knew that explaining everything too early would defeat its purpose." I continued reading. "The boxes are not arranged by value, they are arranged by character." I frowned. Character. The first boxes contain memories because memories reveal gratitude. The later boxes contain responsibilities because responsibility reveals integrity. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Never allow anyone to open the entire collection at once. The order matters more than the contents." I read those words 3 more times. The order matters more than the contents. Suddenly, Daniel's strange behavior made sense. So did the numbered boxes. So did Brandon's repeated questions about specific numbers. Someone who believed the boxes were simply containers would never understand. Someone who understood Charles would realize the sequence itself was the message. The final paragraph nearly broke my heart. "Please don't judge too quickly if someone disappoints you. People sometimes lose their way before they find it again. Give truth the opportunity to teach what anger never can." I folded the letter carefully. Even now, Charles wasn't asking for revenge. He was asking for patience. That afternoon, I called Helen Brooks. She and Charles had worked together for nearly 20 years before she retired from the appraisal business. If anyone besides Daniel understood the way Charles thought, it was Helen. She answered on the second ring. "Marlene, I was just thinking about you. I think I found something. You sound shaken." "I found Charles's journal." There was a brief silence. "I wondered when you would." "You knew it existed." "I knew he kept one." "You never mentioned it." "It wasn't my place." I hesitated. "Helen, did Charles ever talk to you about the storage unit?" She answered carefully. "Not about what was inside." But he once told me something I've never forgotten. What? He said most people spend their lives collecting possessions. I'm trying to collect perspective. I smiled despite myself. That sounds exactly like him. It certainly does. Helen, do you think Brandon has changed? She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the gentleness of someone choosing every word with care. I think grief affects people differently. That's not what I asked. No. She sighed softly. I think Brandon has begun measuring life by numbers for so long that he may have forgotten how to measure it by memories. After we ended the call, I sat quietly beside my living room window. Snow had begun falling outside, covering the neighborhood in soft white silence. Christmas was only 3 weeks away. I looked at the letter resting in my lap. The order matters more than the contents. For the first time, I realized Christmas dinner would never simply be a family gathering. It would become the moment Charles had quietly prepared for years. Not to expose greed, not to embarrass anyone, but to let every person in that room reveal through their own choices what they truly believed was worth protecting. And somehow, deep inside my heart, I knew that when Box 1 was finally opened, it wouldn't just reveal the past, it would reveal every one of us. The week before Christmas has always felt different to me, not because of the presents, not because of the decorations, because it is the one week each year when people willingly slow down long enough to remember who matters most. Or at least that was what Charles always believed. The first Saturday in December, I stood on a small step stool in my living room, carefully hanging the last glass ornament on the Christmas tree. It had belonged to Charles's grandmother. Hand-blown glass, over 90 years old. Delicate enough that I held my breath every time I touched it. As I stepped down, my phone rang. Morning, Mom. Brandon. Good morning. How's the decorating going? Almost finished. You still putting up that enormous tree every year? I smiled. Your father would have haunted me if I didn't. He laughed. I probably would too. For a brief moment, he sounded like the little boy who used to sneak candy canes off the tree when he thought I wasn't looking. Then his voice changed. So, have you given any more thought to the storage unit? There it was again. Always the storage unit. I walked to the window before answering. No. You really should. I'll deal with it when I'm ready. Mom. His tone remained gentle, but something underneath it felt increasingly impatient. You know I'm only trying to help. I know that's what you're saying. What does that mean? It means exactly what I said. Silence. Finally he sighed. I just hate seeing you waste money. I appreciate your concern. We could empty everything in one weekend. I don't want to. What if something happens to you? The question caught me off guard. What? I mean, you're 67. I noticed. If you became sick or couldn't manage things, I'll make arrangements. I'm just trying to think ahead. So am I. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Brandon forced a cheerful laugh. Well, I'll see you on Christmas Eve. You certainly will. After hanging up, I stared at the silent phone. Something had changed. He wasn't merely making suggestions anymore. He was becoming anxious, as though time itself mattered. That afternoon, I drove across town to Daniel Foster's office. He occupied the same brick building where he had practiced law for over 40 years. Nothing inside had changed. Dark walnut shelves, leather chairs, old legal books that smelled faintly of dust and polished wood. Daniel looked up as I entered. I had a feeling I'd be seeing you. I think Brandon's getting nervous. He motioned toward the chair opposite his desk. What happened? I explained our phone conversation almost word for word. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back thoughtfully. He asked what would happen if something happened to you. Yes. Interesting. Why? Because Charles asked me to prepare something specifically for that possibility. I frowned. What kind of something? A contingency. You mean a will? No. A trust? No. He folded his hands carefully. I promised Charles I wouldn't discuss it until the proper time. I couldn't help smiling. You lawyers really enjoy saying that. He laughed. No. Clients like Charles make us say it. He opened a drawer and removed a sealed cream-colored envelope. Across the front was written in Charles's familiar handwriting, "To be delivered only if Marlene chooses Christmas." I blinked. Christmas. Daniel nodded. He left 3 possible instructions. 3. If you chose to open the collection privately, he held up one finger. If you chose to open everything legally, a second finger. And if you chose Christmas with the family present, the third finger. You already know which one he hoped you'd choose. My heart tightened. He actually wrote Christmas. Daniel turned the envelope toward me. There it was, my husband's handwriting, steady, confident, almost as though he were still sitting across the breakfast table planning our holiday. I can give you this now. You've read it. No. You never opened it. I've never broken a client's seal. That was Daniel, dependable to the point of stubbornness. I accepted the envelope but didn't open it. Not yet. It rested in my purse all the way home. That evening, Helen Brooks came over carrying homemade cinnamon bread. She claimed she baked too much every December. I suspected she simply knew I shouldn't spend every evening alone. We sat beside the fireplace while snow drifted quietly outside. After a long conversation about ordinary things, I finally asked, "Helen." "Yes." "Did Charles ever seem worried about Brandon?" She thought for a long moment. "No." "Really? He worried about everyone." "What do you mean?" "He believed every family eventually reaches a crossroads. A crossroads. One path values people. The other values possessions." She smiled gently. "He never claimed to know which path someone would choose." I stared into the fire. "I'm afraid I already know." Helen reached over and squeezed my hand. "No, you don't. You only know what Brandon has been saying. Isn't that enough?" "No." She shook her head. "Character isn't measured by words spoken before the truth arrives." That sentence stayed with me. Character isn't measured before the truth arrives. Perhaps that was exactly what Charles had been trying to prove. Not whether Brandon asked about the storage unit, but what Brandon would do once the truth stood directly in front of him. 3 days later, Lucas unexpectedly stopped by after school. He still wore his backpack. "Grandma, what a nice surprise. Dad said you might need help putting lights outside." I smiled. "Your father volunteered you." Lucas grinned. "Pretty much." For the next 2 hours, we untangled lights, climbed ladders, and decorated bushes, exactly the way Charles used to every December. Unlike Brandon, Lucas asked almost nothing about the storage unit. Instead, he asked about his grandfather. What was Grandpa like when he was my age? What was his favorite Christmas? Did he always love old things? Each question made me smile. While wrapping lights around the front porch railing, Lucas suddenly asked, "Grandma." "Yes." "Why does Dad dislike your storage unit so much?" The question surprised me. "What makes you think he dislikes it? He talks about it a lot." I nodded slowly. "He probably thinks I'm wasting money." Lucas looked unconvinced. "Maybe." He hesitated. "I heard him talking to Mom one night." My hands froze. "What did he say?" I wasn't trying to listen. "I know. He said—" Lucas searched his memory. "If she would just open the first boxes, we'd finally know." My pulse quickened. I don't know. Was that all?" He also said Grandpa never told anyone where everything was. Everything. Not antiques, not documents, everything. I forced myself to keep my voice calm. "When did you hear that?" "A couple months ago." He shrugged. "I didn't think it mattered." It probably didn't. But inside I knew it mattered very much. After Lucas went home, I stood alone in my quiet house. I walked to the dining room cabinet and removed the leather journal. Beside it, I placed Daniel's sealed envelope. Then I looked toward the hallway closet where I had hidden the key to the storage unit. Charles had prepared the boxes. Daniel had protected the instructions. Helen had reminded me to wait for truth. Now even Lucas had unknowingly confirmed that Brandon believed the answers were hidden inside the first boxes. For weeks, I had been wondering whether Christmas was the right moment. That night, I finally stopped wondering. I picked up my phone. When Brandon answered, I smiled softly. "Merry almost Christmas." He laughed. "Merry Christmas, Mom. I've made a decision." "Oh, you're right." There was an eagerness in his voice I hadn't heard before. "About what?" "The storage unit." A pause. "I think it's finally time everyone sees what's inside." He sounded almost relieved. "I think that's a wonderful idea." "So do I." I looked toward the calendar. Christmas Eve. Only 4 days away. And for the first time since Charles died, I knew exactly how his final lesson would begin. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in fresh snow. From my bedroom window, the neighborhood looked like the inside of an old Christmas card. Every rooftop wore a blanket of white, and the maple tree Charles had planted decades earlier shimmered beneath a layer of ice crystals that caught the pale winter sun. For a few precious minutes, everything looked peaceful. If someone had driven past my house, they would have seen an elderly widow sipping coffee by the window, smiling quietly at the beauty of Christmas. They never would have guessed that I was about to carry the first piece of my late husband's final lesson into my son's home. I had barely slept. Not because I was afraid, because I kept hearing Charles's words. "The order matters more than the contents." I repeated them to myself while dressing, while wrapping presents, while placing homemade pecan pie into a carrier. Everything about today depended on one simple decision. I could still change my mind. I could leave box 1 exactly where it was. Nobody expected me to bring it. Nobody except Charles. After breakfast, I drove to Buckeye Secure Storage one last time. The roads were nearly empty. Most families were already gathering around fireplaces or finishing last-minute cooking. Sandra looked surprised when I walked through the office. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Ashford." "Merry Christmas." "I wasn't expecting anyone today." "Neither was I," she smiled. "Box 1." I blinked. "How did you know?" She laughed. "I've watched you stare at that first shelf for weeks." I suppose I wasn't very subtle. "You look like someone trying to decide whether to open a door." I think that's exactly what I was doing. She handed me the visitor clipboard. "I hope whatever's inside brings you peace." So do I. Inside the storage unit, I stood silently before the shelves. Everything remained exactly as Charles had left it. The numbered boxes looked almost ordinary. Simple cardboard, neatly stacked. Nothing about them suggested they had occupied my thoughts for months. I reached toward box 1. For a brief moment, my hand hesitated. "Ready," I whispered aloud. The room, of course, remained silent. Then I smiled. Charles had always teased me for talking to myself. "No," I corrected softly. "I'm talking to you." The box was lighter than I remembered. Carefully, I carried it to the car and secured it with blankets so nothing inside would shift during the drive. I never opened it, not even a little. I wanted the first person to see inside that box to be exactly who Charles intended: our family. Brandon's house glowed with Christmas lights long before I turned into the driveway. His neighborhood looked beautiful. Inflatable snowmen stood in front yards. Children built snow forts. Someone across the street was playing Christmas music loudly enough that I could hear Bing Crosby before stepping out of my car. Lucas opened the front door before I even reached the porch. "Grandma." He wrapped me in a hug. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." He carried my pie inside while I followed with presents. I left box 1 hidden beneath a thick blanket in the trunk. Not yet. Inside, the house smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon fresh bread, and evergreen candles. Rachel hurried over. "Marlene, you made it." She hugged me warmly. "You look wonderful." "So do you." "I hope you didn't bring too much." "Oh, only a pie," she laughed. "Good. Brandon keeps insisting we've made enough food for 50 people. The dining room buzzed with conversation. Brandon's cousins had already arrived. His younger sister's family was visiting from Cincinnati. Several nieces and nephews crowded around the Christmas tree while football played quietly on the television. Everything looked normal, comfortable. Exactly the kind of Christmas Charles had always loved. Brandon walked over, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling cider. Merry Christmas, Mom. Merry Christmas. He hugged me tightly. For a moment I felt the familiar warmth of my son. The same little boy who used to wake us before sunrise every Christmas morning because he couldn't wait another minute to open presents. Maybe I really had imagined everything. Maybe grief had distorted my judgment. Then Brandon smiled. So, here it comes, I thought. Did you happen to bring anything interesting from storage? There it was. Not how have you been, not are you feeling okay storage. Again, I kept my expression pleasant. Perhaps, his eyebrows lifted. Oh, I thought Christmas might be an appropriate time. His smile widened. I couldn't agree more. Rachel looked between us. What are you two talking about? Mom finally decided to go through that storage unit. Rachel clapped her hands. That's wonderful. I've been telling her for months. I simply smiled. Sometimes timing matters. Lunch passed peacefully. Children laughed. Stories were shared. Old family photographs circulated around the table. Several relatives asked about retirement. Others asked whether I planned to travel more. Only Brandon seemed distracted. Every 15 or 20 minutes, his eyes drifted toward the front window, toward the driveway, toward my car. He wasn't subtle anymore. I noticed. So did Lucas. At one point, my grandson leaned close and whispered, "Dad seems nervous." What makes you say that? He's checked outside 3 times. I pretended not to notice. I'm sure he's just expecting someone. Lucas frowned. Maybe. After dinner came dessert. Rachel proudly served pumpkin pie, apple pie, pecan pie, and homemade cookies. Coffee cups were filled. Conversations became quieter. People leaned back comfortably in their chairs. This was the moment Charles had predicted. Not before dinner. Not after everyone had gone home. Right here. When everyone felt safe. I placed my coffee cup on the table. I have a Christmas surprise. The room became pleasantly attentive. Brandon smiled. I wondered if you did. I actually need a little help. I turned toward Lucas. Sweetheart. Yes, Grandma. Would you mind bringing something from my car? Of course. The trunk. He nodded. What am I looking for? A cardboard box under a blue blanket. Brandon's smile froze. His fingers stopped moving. Rachel looked confused. You brought one of the storage boxes. I did. Oh, she laughed lightly. I thought maybe you finally cleaned out a closet. No. I looked directly at Brandon. I thought we should begin exactly where your father intended. No one seemed to understand what I meant, except Brandon. Lucas disappeared outside. The room suddenly felt unusually quiet. Even the children sensed something had changed. One cousin looked toward Brandon. You okay? Fine. He answered too quickly. I'm perfectly fine. But he wasn't. His knee bounced beneath the table. He reached for his coffee and nearly knocked over the cup. For the first time all evening, my son looked afraid. Seconds later, the front door opened. Lucas struggled slightly beneath the weight of the weathered cardboard box. I got it. I'll help you, Brandon said, immediately rising so quickly his chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. It's okay, I said gently. Lucas has it. My grandson carried the box carefully into the dining room and placed it exactly where I pointed, the center of the Christmas table. Every conversation stopped. Every eye settled on the faded cardboard. Someone chuckled softly. So that's the famous junk. Another relative smiled. I expected something bigger. Brandon didn't laugh. Neither did I. I slowly stood, rested both hands on the worn lid, then looked around the table, at my children, my grandchildren, my husband's oldest friends, my family. Finally, I looked directly into Brandon's eyes. If everyone truly believes my storage unit contains nothing but worthless junk, I said calmly, then I think Christmas is the perfect time to begin with box 1. For the first time in my son's life, I watched every trace of color disappear from his face. No one spoke. The crackling fire in the living room suddenly sounded louder than the people gathered around the dining table. I rested my fingertips on the brittle tape sealing the top of box 1. For a moment, I closed my eyes. Not because I was afraid of what everyone else might see, because I remembered the last time Charles and I had packed this box together. It had been almost 12 years earlier. He had carefully wrapped every item in acid-free paper, explaining why ordinary newspaper would eventually damage photographs and old documents. Some memories deserve better than convenience, he'd said with that quiet smile I loved so much. At the time, I thought he was simply protecting antiques. Now I understood. He had been protecting people. I opened my eyes. Without looking at Brandon, I picked up a small utility knife from my purse and sliced carefully through the yellowed packing tape. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Several relatives leaned forward in their chairs. Rachel folded her hands together nervously. Lucas stood beside me, his eyes fixed on the box. Even the younger children stopped whispering. I folded back the cardboard flaps. Inside lay a thick layer of white tissue paper. Nothing more. Someone near the end of the table chuckled. I thought we'd at least see treasure. Another cousin smiled. Maybe it's just old dishes. I didn't respond. Instead, I slowly lifted away the first layer of tissue paper. A familiar scent drifted upward. Old cedar. Paper. Leather. Time. The very first object resting inside was a worn, leather-bound family Bible. Its dark brown cover was cracked from decades of use. The gold lettering had almost disappeared. I smiled softly. My grandmother gave this to Charles and me on our wedding day. I gently placed it on the table. Rachel looked surprised. I've never seen that before. You haven't. Brandon stared silently. Next came a faded black and white wedding photograph. Not mine. Charles's parents. His mother stood in a simple white dress, smiling shyly beside a young soldier who would later become my father-in-law. The edges of the photograph had begun curling with age. Lucas leaned closer. That's great-grandpa. I nodded. He had just returned from World War II. Lucas picked up the picture carefully, almost reverently. He looked so young. He was. He couldn't have been much older than I am. No. The room grew noticeably quieter. One by one, I removed more items. An embroidered baby blanket, Charles's first pair of tiny leather shoes, a yellowed birth certificate, a faded Christmas card from 1958 signed by every member of his family, an old pocket watch engraved with the words, "To Thomas Ashford, Christmas 1944. Helen Brooks smiled immediately. I remember that watch. So do I. It stopped working years ago. It wasn't supposed to tell time anymore. She nodded knowingly. It told stories. Exactly. That was Charles. Nothing existed in isolation. Every object belonged to a life. Every life belonged to someone who mattered. As more treasures covered the table, the atmosphere changed completely. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody called anything junk. Several relatives quietly picked up photographs, passing them carefully from hand to hand. One cousin gasped. Oh my goodness! She held up an old newspaper clipping. This is Uncle Thomas receiving his military commendation. I've never seen this. Neither had I. Charles had quietly preserved things even I didn't know existed. Lucas unfolded another envelope. Grandma? Yes. Can I open this? I smiled. Go ahead. Inside were children's Christmas drawings. Brandon's, made in elementary school, crayon reindeer, stick figure snowmen, a crooked Christmas tree with far too many ornaments. Across the bottom, in awkward 7-year-old handwriting, were the words, I love Mom and Dad forever. Lucas smiled. Dad drew this? Yes. He looked across the table at Brandon. You were pretty good. A few people laughed softly. Brandon managed a weak smile. I forgot that even existed. No, I answered quietly. Your father didn't. Silence returned. I reached deeper into the box. The next item made my breath catch. Charles's military medals, perfectly polished, arranged inside a velvet display case. Rachel placed a hand over her mouth. I thought these were lost. So did I, another relative whispered. No, I said. They were simply protected. Daniel Foster, who had remained unusually quiet throughout the evening, finally spoke. Charles asked me once what people think inheritance looks like. Several family members turned toward him. He said everyone imagines dollar signs. Daniel smiled faintly, but he believed inheritance begins with memory. I nodded. That's exactly what he believed. The next item I removed was wrapped more carefully than anything else. Several layers of cloth, then another layer of tissue. Finally, an old leather photo album. Its cover had become soft with age. The corners were worn nearly smooth. I opened the first page. Inside were photographs spanning nearly 70 years of Ashford family history. Birthdays, graduations, fishing trips, anniversaries, picnics, Christmas mornings, hospital visits, first bicycles, college acceptance letters, every generation, every milestone, every smile. Lucas quietly sat beside me, turning the pages one at a time. Grandma. Yes. I never knew Grandpa kept all this. He wanted you to. When? When the time was right. Rachel wiped tears from her eyes. I can't believe we almost threw this away. The words hung in the room. Nobody corrected her. Nobody needed to. Brandon stared at the photographs without speaking. His expression had changed completely. Whatever he had expected inside box 1, it hadn't been this. Finally, he cleared his throat. I honestly thought... His voice faded. You thought what? I thought it was just old stuff. I looked at him calmly. It is old. No. He shook his head. I mean, he couldn't finish. I understood. Because there was no sentence capable of repairing what had already been said. Old stuff. Junk. Worthless. 3 words that had vanished forever beneath the weight of a single cardboard box. I reached into the very bottom. Only one item remained. A plain white envelope. Across the front, written in Charles's elegant handwriting, were 6 simple words. Open only after the memories. My heart skipped. I hadn't known this envelope existed. Daniel looked at it and smiled gently. So, you've reached it. You knew... I knew there would be one. But not what it says. No. I looked around the table. Every face watched silently. Nobody touched dessert anymore. Nobody reached for coffee. Christmas dinner had become something entirely different. Slowly, very slowly. I held the envelope in both hands. This, I whispered, was your grandfather. He always believed memories should speak before money. Brandon lowered his eyes. I noticed tears gathering there. Real tears. Not dramatic, not performative. The quiet kind that arrive when someone suddenly sees themselves more clearly than they ever wanted to. Before opening the envelope, I looked once more at everything spread across the dining table. Photographs, letters, medals, childhood drawings, wedding keepsakes, generations of family history, everything my son had publicly dismissed as junk. Charles had been right. Box 1 wasn't about valuables, it was about gratitude. And looking around that silent room, I realized something else. Every single person sitting at that table had already begun revealing exactly what mattered most to them. I gently slipped my finger beneath the flap of the envelope, then stopped. This, I said softly, looking at my family, is where your grandfather's real lesson begins. For several seconds, I simply held the envelope. No one urged me to hurry. No one reached for another slice of pie. Even the younger children seemed to understand that Christmas dinner had quietly become something far more important than presents or dessert. The envelope felt surprisingly light in my hands. Its cream-colored paper had yellowed with age, and Charles's handwriting looked as steady as the day he had written it. Open only after the memories. I smiled through the sting of tears. That sounds exactly like him, Helen Brooks whispered. It does, I replied. I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of stationery. At the top, Charles had written only 4 words. To my entire family. I took a slow breath. I think he'd want all of you to hear this. No one objected. I unfolded the letter and began to read. If this letter is being read, then box 1 has already done its job. A quiet murmur spread around the table. I continued. If you have laughed together while looking at these photographs, then you already understand why I placed them first. If you have cried, then you understand even more. I looked around the room. Rachel was already wiping tears from beneath her glasses. Lucas still held Brandon's childhood Christmas drawing in his lap. I continued reading. Every family eventually reaches a moment when someone must decide whether the past is a burden or a blessing. Objects are easy to sell. Stories disappear forever. The room remained perfectly still. If you open this box hoping to find money, then you have probably been disappointed. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared. Charles had always possessed an uncanny ability to speak directly to people's hearts. If you open this box hoping to remember who we were, then you have already received something priceless. I paused again. Brandon lowered his eyes. I couldn't tell whether he was avoiding mine or simply staring at the old family photographs scattered across the table. Either way, I kept reading. Our family never became wealthy because of antiques. We became comfortable because people trusted our honesty. Never exchanged trust for profit. Daniel quietly nodded. He had heard Charles say those words countless times during business meetings. The first box contains memories, because memories remind us what love looked like before anyone argued about ownership. A deep silence settled over the dining room. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The only sound came from the fireplace crackling in the next room. Then I reached the next paragraph. It made me stop. Someone at this table may already believe the remaining boxes contain something far more valuable. My hands froze, slowly, almost involuntarily. Several people glanced toward Brandon. His shoulders stiffened. Rachel noticed the movement and looked at him too. I forced myself to continue. Perhaps they do. Perhaps they don't. That is not today's lesson. I let out a quiet breath. Charles hadn't accused anyone. He hadn't singled anyone out. Instead, he had acknowledged the possibility of temptation without naming a single person. That was exactly the man I had married. Never humiliating. Always inviting people to examine themselves first. I continued. Before another box is opened, ask yourself one question. If every valuable object disappeared tonight, would this family still have something worth protecting? No one spoke. Lucas slowly looked around the table. I think we would, he said softly. Every adult turned toward him. He shrugged awkwardly. I mean, if we still had each other. Helen smiled through her tears. That's your grandfather talking. No, I answered. That's Lucas. Charles would have been proud. I continued reading. If your answer was yes, then never allow money to convince you otherwise. If your answer was no, then no inheritance will ever be large enough. I folded the letter onto my lap. For a long moment, nobody moved. Finally, Brandon cleared his throat. He stopped. His voice sounded unusually uncertain. I didn't know Dad wrote things like this. Rachel looked at him with surprise. You never read any of his journals? Brandon shook his head. No. I guess I always thought... He hesitated. What? I thought Mom kept old things because she couldn't let go. His words hung in the room. Then he looked directly at me. I never realized Dad was preserving... us. My heart softened. Not completely, but enough. Before I could answer, Daniel leaned forward. Charles once told me something I've never forgotten. Everyone looked toward him. He said history isn't preserved for the dead. Daniel smiled gently. It's preserved for the living, who haven't yet realized they'll someday miss it. Rachel quietly reached for one of the photographs. It showed Brandon at 8 years old, proudly holding the first fish he had ever caught with Charles. I remember this trip, she whispered. I've never seen this picture. You weren't part of the family yet, I said. She smiled sadly. I wish I had known him longer. So do I. Across the table, one of Brandon's cousins carefully picked up Thomas Ashford's military medals. I can't believe these were sitting in storage all these years. They weren't sitting, I answered. They were waiting. Waiting. For the right moment. Lucas looked at me. So Grandpa planned all this? Yes. When? Years ago. He knew we'd all be here. I don't think he knew exactly who would be sitting at this table. I smiled softly, but I think he hoped. Lucas stared at the photographs again. He was really smart. A ripple of gentle laughter spread through the room. He certainly was, Helen agreed. For the first time all evening, the tension eased slightly. People began passing photographs around again. Someone recognized an old farmhouse. Another relative identified a great aunt no one had mentioned in years. Stories replaced silence. Laughter slowly returned. Not loud laughter, warm laughter, the kind Charles had always loved. I watched Brandon quietly studying one particular photograph. It showed him at about 10 years old sitting beside Charles at our workshop. His tiny hands held a brass compass they had restored together. He looked up at me. I honestly forgot this day. I never did. Dad kept the picture. He kept all of them. Brandon swallowed. I called all this junk. No, I answered gently. You called it that before you knew what was inside. His eyes filled again. I still shouldn't have. Before I could respond, Daniel cleared his throat. There is one thing Charles specifically asked me to remind everyone. Every face turned toward him. He instructed that no one should assume Box 1 explained everything. Rachel frowned. What do you mean? Daniel smiled faintly. It means Charles never wasted an opportunity to teach more than one lesson. He looked directly at me. Marlene. Yes. I believe your husband expected tonight to continue. I understood immediately. The remaining boxes, the sequence, the order. Charles had never intended for Box 1 to stand alone. It had only prepared every heart in the room for what came next. I carefully folded Charles's Christmas letter and slipped it back into its envelope. Then I looked at the dozens of keepsakes spread across the dining table. No one saw junk anymore. They saw grandparents, childhood, service, love, family. Exactly as Charles intended. I smiled quietly. Your grandfather always believed the first lesson should touch the heart. I rested my hand gently on the empty cardboard box. And tomorrow, I looked toward Brandon. The second lesson begins. For the first time that evening, I saw genuine uncertainty in my son's eyes, because whatever he believed waited inside the next box. He no longer felt certain he wanted to be right. Christmas morning arrived unusually quiet. Most of the family had stayed overnight, filling Brandon and Rachel's house with the comforting sounds of relatives waking slowly, coffee brewing in the kitchen, and children whispering as they compared the gifts they had opened before breakfast. Yet beneath the warmth of the holiday lingered something else. Expectation. No one mentioned Box 2, not at first, but everyone thought about it. I could see it in the way Brandon kept glancing toward the foyer where Box 1 now rested neatly closed after we had carefully returned every photograph, metal letter, and keepsake to its proper place. Charles would have insisted everything go back exactly as it had been. After breakfast, Lucas found me standing on the back patio, watching fresh snow fall across the yard. Grandma. Good morning again, he smiled. I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa's letter. Neither could I. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. Was he really planning all this for years? I believe he was. Do you think he knew Dad would say those things? I answered honestly. I don't think your grandfather expected anyone to fail. Lucas looked confused. Then why make all these boxes? Because he understood something important. What? Good people sometimes make poor choices. The truth gives them an opportunity to make better ones. Lucas nodded thoughtfully. I hope Dad gets that chance. So do I. His words stayed with me as we returned inside. By late morning, everyone had gathered again in the living room. The children played board games on the floor while the adults sipped coffee and talked about holiday travel. Eventually, Brandon walked over. Mom, yes. About yesterday. I looked up. I owe you an apology. His voice was quiet enough that only Rachel, Daniel, Helen, and I could hear. I shouldn't have called your memories junk. I studied his face. He looked sincere, ashamed. But there was something else beneath the apology. Curiosity. He still wanted answers. I appreciate your apology, I said. I mean it. I know. He hesitated. So, I couldn't help smiling. You're wondering about box 2. A faint blush crossed his face. I suppose I am. Daniel chuckled softly from across the room. Patience has never been your strongest quality, Brandon. I guess not. Rachel touched her husband's arm. We don't have to do this today. Before Brandon could answer, I spoke. We're going to. Everyone nearby turned toward me. Charles never intended these lessons to be spread across months. Daniel nodded. That's true. I walked to my purse and removed a ring of keys. One key was slightly longer than the others. The storage unit key. I'll be back in an hour. Brandon immediately stood. I'll drive. I looked at him for several seconds. No. I'd like to come. I know. I really want to understand. So do I. I smiled gently. That's why I need to go alone. For just a moment, disappointment flashed across his face. Then he nodded. I understand. Whether he truly did or not, I couldn't tell. The drive to Buckeye Secure Storage felt different this time. Yesterday I had been carrying hope. Today I carried responsibility. Charles's letter had reminded everyone that memories came first. Now came the difficult part. Sandra greeted me with another warm smile. Merry Christmas again. Merry Christmas. Back for another box. Yes, she laughed. I had a feeling one wouldn't be enough. Inside the storage unit, I walked directly to shelf 1. Box 2 sat exactly where Charles had placed it over a decade earlier. Unlike box 1, it was noticeably heavier. As I lifted it, I noticed another envelope taped discreetly beneath the lid. This one bore my name, Marlene. Only that, nothing more. I carefully removed it, but didn't open it. Not yet. I carried box 2 to my car and returned to Brandon's house just before lunch. Conversation stopped the moment everyone saw the box. Children instinctively moved aside. Rachel quietly cleared the dining table. No one joked this time. No one smiled nervously. Everyone understood these moments mattered. I placed box 2 in the center of the table. Then I held up the small envelope addressed to me. I found this attached underneath. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I wasn't expecting that. Neither was I. Read it first. I opened the envelope. Inside was a short handwritten note. My darling, if you're reading this before opening box 2, then box 1 accomplished what it was supposed to. I smiled despite the tears threatening to return. This next box is different. Memories soften hearts. Truth tests them. The room became perfectly silent. I continued. Do not read every document aloud. Allow people to see enough to understand. Humiliation teaches very little. Understanding teaches much more. I lowered the note. Even now, even after death, Charles cared more about restoration than punishment. Daniel smiled quietly. That sounds exactly like him. It does. I slipped the note into my pocket. Then I opened box 2. Unlike the first box, there were no photographs resting on top. Instead, everything had been arranged inside sturdy archival folders. Each folder carried a typed label: business records, correspondence, insurance, appraisals, offers. The final folder immediately caught Brandon's attention. Offers. I noticed him staring at it. So did Rachel. I removed the folder and laid it gently on the table. What is it? One cousin asked. Letters, I replied. Offers to purchase pieces from our collection. Rachel frowned. I didn't know anyone ever tried to buy them. Oh, they did. For years. I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of neatly organized letters from collectors' museums, universities, and auction houses dating back nearly 20 years. Most had polite requests. Some contained generous purchase offers. Others had handwritten notes from historians asking permission to study particular artifacts. Helen leaned closer. I remember several of these. So do I. One letter offered over $40,000 for a rare 19th century surveyor's compass. Another proposed purchasing Charles's Civil War document collection. Each letter had Charles's handwritten response attached. Every response was nearly identical. Not for sale. Family history comes first. Rachel whispered softly. He turned all of these down. Every single one. Even $40,000. I nodded. He believed some things become poorer the moment they're separated. Brandon remained silent. I reached deeper into the folder. Near the back rested several more recent documents. Not old. Not 20 years old. Only 18 months old. The date immediately caught my attention. About 6 months after Charles's funeral. I frowned. I didn't remember these. I carefully unfolded the first page. It wasn't a purchase offer. It was an email printout. Across the top appeared the logo of a respected regional auction company. The subject line read, "Preliminary Consultation Request." My heartbeat quickened. The sender had requested a confidential estimate for several unidentified family antiques. I slowly looked toward the signature at the bottom of the page. Every eye in the room followed mine. The name there was unmistakable. Brandon Ashford. The room fell completely silent. Brandon stared at the paper as though he had forgotten it ever existed. Rachel slowly turned toward her husband. "Brandon." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "You contacted an auction house." He opened his mouth. But for the first time in his life, no words came out. No one moved. The silence that followed Rachel's question felt heavier than anything I had experienced since Charles's funeral. Brandon stared at the email in front of him as though it belonged to someone else. Rachel spoke again, her voice trembling. "You contacted an auction house." Brandon finally nodded once. Yes." Her eyes widened. "When?" He swallowed hard. "A little over a year ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't think it mattered." Rachel let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "You didn't think it mattered?" "No." She looked at me, then back at him. "You told me your mother refused to let go of worthless clutter. I believed that. You believed it enough to contact an auction company." Brandon rubbed both hands across his face. "I wanted to know whether there was anything valuable." The room remained silent. No one interrupted him. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "Go on." Brandon looked uncomfortable. "I wasn't trying to steal anything." "No one has accused you of stealing," Daniel replied calmly. "I just wanted information." I gently slid another sheet of paper from the folder. There was more than one email. Brandon's shoulders dropped. "I know." The second page showed an exchange between Brandon and a senior consultant at the auction house. The consultant had responded professionally. "Without photographs or documentation, we cannot estimate value. If the collection belongs to another owner, written authorization will be required before any inspection." Brandon had replied only 2 days later. "Understood. I believe ownership will eventually transfer to me." Rachel stared at the sentence. "You wrote that?" Brandon nodded. "I did." She looked completely stunned. "You were already planning your mother's estate?" "No. I was planning ahead." "For what?" He hesitated. "I thought—" He stopped again. "What?" Rachel asked. "I thought Mom would eventually want help." I spoke softly. "So instead of asking me, you contacted an auction house." His eyes filled with regret. "Yes. I never intended to sell anything without your permission." "I believe you." He looked up in surprise. "You do?" "I believe that was true at the time." The relief on his face lasted only a second. "At the time," he repeated. I nodded. "Because intentions have a way of changing when money enters the conversation." No one argued. I reached deeper into the folder and removed another document. Unlike the emails, this one was handwritten. Charles's handwriting. Rachel noticed immediately. Another letter. No. I unfolded it carefully. It appears to be one of Charles's business notes. At the top, he had written regarding future offers. Beneath that, in neat script, was a paragraph. "Collectors will always ask to purchase individual pieces. Museums will ask. Auction houses will ask. Private buyers will ask. If anyone in the family ever begins measuring these objects only by price, they have already misunderstood why we preserved them." Helen smiled sadly. "That sounds exactly like Charles." "It does. I continued reading. The greatest danger is not that strangers will buy our history. The greatest danger is that someone who loves us will unknowingly separate it one piece at a time. The words settled over the room. Brandon slowly lowered his head. I never thought about it like that. I know. He looked at me. I honestly believed selling a few things could help everyone. I know. I wasn't trying to erase Dad. I know. Those 3 words surprised even me. Because they were true. For months I had worried Brandon was driven entirely by greed. Now, watching him struggle beneath the weight of his own decisions, I saw something more complicated. He hadn't hated history. He simply hadn't understood it. There is a difference. Rachel reached for Brandon's hand. Why didn't you tell me about any of this? I was embarrassed. Embarrassed. I knew Dad would have hated the idea. Daniel quietly nodded. He probably would have. Brandon gave a sad smile. That's exactly why I never mentioned it. Lucas had remained silent through the entire conversation. Now he spoke. Dad? Brandon looked at his son. Yeah. When Grandpa took me fishing last summer before he got sick. A faint smile crossed Brandon's face. I remember. He told me something. What was that? Lucas looked around the table before answering. He said people should never make permanent decisions while they're grieving. I felt my breath catch. Charles had said something very similar to me after his own father died. Lucas continued. He said grief makes people want to solve problems too fast. No one spoke. The words hung gently in the room. Brandon looked at his son for a long time. I forgot he told you that. I didn't. Another long silence followed. Finally, Brandon stood. He walked slowly around the table until he stood beside me. For a moment, I thought he might try to defend himself again. Instead, he looked down at box 2. I spent almost 2 years believing these boxes were keeping us from moving forward. He looked at the photographs from box 1. Now I think... His voice cracked. I think they were the only thing keeping us connected. I reached over and squeezed his hand. You finally understand your father. He shook his head. Not completely. No, I smiled gently. Neither did I. A few quiet laughs broke the tension. Even Daniel smiled. You spent 43 years married to him, he said. I'm not sure anyone ever completely understood Charles. Helen laughed. That man could hide a birthday present inside the refrigerator and we'd still never find it. For the first time since opening box 2, genuine laughter filled the room. It wasn't forced. It wasn't nervous. It was healing. After everyone settled again, I carefully organized the papers back into their folder. Only then did I notice another thin envelope resting beneath the stack. Unlike the others, this one wasn't addressed to me. Across the front were 4 handwritten words. Before box 3. Daniel leaned forward. His eyebrows rose. I've never seen that one. Neither have I. Rachel looked at the envelope. Are you going to open it? I considered the question. Then I remembered Charles's first instruction. The order matters more than the contents. I slowly shook my head. No. Brandon looked surprised. Why not? Because your father didn't write open now. I held up the envelope. He wrote before box 3. Daniel smiled. Then that's exactly when it should be opened. I carefully placed the unopened envelope back inside box 2. Several relatives looked curious. One cousin laughed. I don't know whether Charles was brilliant or impossibly stubborn. I smiled. He was both. As everyone helped return the documents to their protective folders, I noticed something remarkable. Yesterday, people had handled the keepsakes with curiosity. Today, they handled the documents with respect. No one asked how much anything was worth. No one asked about inheritance. No one even mentioned auction houses again. Instead, they talked about Charles, his honesty, his patience, his strange habit of leaving puzzles behind. Watching my family together, I realized Box 2 had accomplished exactly what Charles intended. It hadn't exposed a criminal. It had exposed a misunderstanding before it had the chance to become something far worse. And somehow I sensed the hardest lesson was still waiting inside the next box. The house felt different on the morning after Christmas. Not quieter, lighter. The tension that had followed us for months had begun to dissolve, replaced by something far more honest. No one was pretending anymore. Brandon wasn't pretending he had never contacted an auction house. Rachel wasn't pretending she had always understood why I protected the storage unit. Even I wasn't pretending that I hadn't doubted my own son. Truth has a strange effect on families. It hurts first, then it begins to heal. After breakfast, Daniel looked toward me over the rim of his coffee mug. I believe Charles intended us to continue. I nodded. So do I. Brandon looked uncertain. I don't know if I'm ready. Daniel smiled kindly. That's probably why you're finally ready. No one laughed. Instead, Helen quietly reached across the table and squeezed Brandon's shoulder. Your father never designed these boxes to punish you. I know. He designed them to teach all of us. Brandon lowered his eyes. I hope so. I drove to the storage unit alone once again. The drive felt familiar now, almost ceremonial. When I unlocked the metal door, I stood silently in front of the shelves. Box 3 waited exactly where Charles had left it. Before touching it, I remembered the small envelope resting inside Box 2. Before Box 3. I had brought it with me. Carefully, I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. Nothing else. Charles's handwriting greeted me immediately. If you have reached the third box, then someone has probably admitted at least one mistake. I smiled despite myself. He knew people astonishingly well. Do not mistake confession for transformation. Real change is measured by what someone does after the truth becomes uncomfortable. I continued reading. The third lesson is not about money. It is about responsibility. At the bottom of the page, he had written one final instruction. Invite Daniel to explain what I never wanted to explain myself. I folded the letter carefully. Charles had trusted Daniel with something important. I carried Box 3 to the car. Unlike the earlier boxes, this one was surprisingly compact. Heavy. Solid. When I returned to Brandon's house, everyone gathered around the dining table without being asked. No one joked anymore. No one guessed what might be inside. They simply waited. I placed the box in front of me. This one begins with something your grandfather wanted Daniel to explain. Every eye turned toward him. Daniel adjusted his glasses. I've known Charles for 38 years. I prepared contracts for his business. I handled estate matters. I watched him turn down extraordinary offers for pieces collectors would have paid almost anything to own. He paused. But the conversation that stayed with me happened 7 years ago. Brandon leaned forward. What conversation? Daniel looked directly at him. Your father asked me a hypothetical question. What was it? If our family ever begins arguing over objects instead of values, how would you remind them who they really are? The room became still. I told him legal documents couldn't solve that problem. So he smiled. Helen laughed softly. That sounds like Charles. Daniel nodded. He said exactly. That's why I'm building something that isn't just legal. Rachel frowned. You mean the boxes? Yes. Daniel rested both hands on the table. He wasn't organizing property. He was organizing conversations. Those words settled over every person in the room. I slowly opened Box 3. Inside weren't antiques. There were thick binders. Each binder carried a simple title: Family Business, Employee Records, Scholarship Notes, Community Donations. Brandon looked confused. This isn't about us. It is, I answered. I opened the first binder. Inside were photographs of our antique shop from decades earlier. Employees stood smiling beside Charles. Handwritten thank you letters filled several plastic sleeves. One came from a single mother whose medical bills Charles had quietly paid after she lost her job. Another came from a young veteran Charles had hired despite having no experience. A third letter thanked him for restoring church artifacts without charging the congregation. Rachel whispered, I never knew he did these things. Most people didn't. Charles never spoke about generosity. He simply practiced it. Lucas turned another page. Grandma, what is it? These people kept writing to Grandpa for years. They did. Why? Because kindness creates long memories. The next binder contained scholarship applications. Every year, Charles had quietly paid tuition for one local student studying history restoration or museum conservation. No announcements, no publicity, only handwritten notes. One photograph caught my attention. A young woman in graduation robes stood beside Charles. On the back, he had written, First Ashford Heritage Scholarship recipient. Rachel stared at me. I had no idea. Neither did I. I honestly hadn't. Apparently, Charles had continued funding the program privately after I retired. Then Lucas found another envelope. This one was addressed to Daniel. He handed it over. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside was a single page. He read silently before smiling. I suppose he wants me to read this. He looked around the table. If this page is being read, then my family has finally seen that wealth isn't measured only by what we keep. Daniel's voice remained calm. It is measured by what continues benefiting others after we're gone. Helen quietly wiped her eyes. Daniel continued. I spent my career evaluating antiques. Most people wanted to know their market value. Very few asked their human value. Brandon lowered his head again. Daniel reached the final paragraph. If my children inherit anything from me, I hope they inherit the habit of leaving every place, every person, and every generation slightly better than they found them. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence, reflective silence. Finally, Brandon spoke. I spent 2 years worrying about what Dad left behind. He looked slowly around the room. I never asked what he left ahead. No one answered immediately, because there was nothing to add. Charles already had. I closed the final binder and looked at my family. 3 boxes, 3 lessons, memories, truth, responsibility. And somehow I knew Charles still wasn't finished, because resting beneath the binders, almost hidden in the corner, was another sealed envelope. Across the front in familiar handwriting were 4 simple words. The hardest lesson yet. I didn't open it. Instead, I gently placed it back inside the box. Brandon noticed. Aren't you curious? I smiled. More than you can imagine. Then why wait? I looked toward the framed family photograph hanging above his fireplace. Because your father spent years teaching me something. What? Never rush the lesson that changes a person's life. The room fell quiet once more. Somewhere outside, church bells began ringing across the snowy neighborhood. Christmas was ending, but Charles's final gift to his family was only beginning. The days after Christmas passed more quietly than any of us expected. For the first time in months, Brandon stopped asking about the storage unit. He didn't ask about the remaining boxes. He didn't ask about appraisals. He didn't ask about money. Instead, he asked something he hadn't asked in years. Mom, would you tell me about Grandpa Thomas? It happened 3 days after Christmas while we were sitting in my kitchen. Snow still covered the backyard and the old maple tree outside the window looked almost silver beneath the morning sun. I poured coffee into 2 mugs and smiled. That's not the question I expected. I know. He looked embarrassed. I've realized I know almost nothing about the people whose photographs were in box 1. I handed him his coffee. Then today we'll fix that. For nearly 2 hours we talked. Not about antiques, not about inheritance, about people. I told him how Thomas Ashford had returned from World War II with almost nothing except the pocket watch that now rested safely back inside box 1. I told him about Charles's mother Eleanor, who could quilt an entire blanket without ever drawing a pattern. I told him how Charles himself had spent his first summer earnings restoring a broken rocking chair for an elderly widow who couldn't afford repairs. Brandon listened quietly. Occasionally he laughed, sometimes he wiped his eyes. Finally he looked at me. I spent so much time thinking about what Dad owned. He shook his head. I never asked who taught him to become the man he was. I smiled sadly. That's exactly why he built those boxes. Later that afternoon, Rachel arrived with Lucas. She carried several grocery bags. I thought I'd make dinner. You don't have to. I know, she smiled. but I'd like to. While she cooked, Lucas wandered into my study. He stood in front of Charles's old desk for several minutes. Grandma. Yes. Can I ask you something? Always. If Grandpa had lived another 10 years, he hesitated. Do you think Dad would have understood all this without the boxes? The question caught me off guard. I thought about it carefully before answering. I honestly don't know. Lucas nodded slowly. I think Grandpa knew time was running out. So do I. That's why he planned everything. I believe you're right. Lucas looked around the room. I wish I'd asked him more questions. I placed an arm around his shoulders. So do I. But here's the wonderful thing. What? You can still keep asking them. He looked confused. How? By reading what he left behind. That evening after dinner, Daniel arrived carrying a long, narrow wooden case. I found something in my office. He placed it gently on the dining table. What is it? Rachel asked. A gift. From Charles. Daniel carefully opened the lid. Inside rested an old brass key. Attached to it was a handwritten tag. Ashford Heritage Workshop. I frowned. I've never seen that key. Daniel smiled. You've seen the building. What building? The old restoration workshop on Maple Street. I blinked. The one Charles rented years ago. Yes. I thought he gave it up. He did. Daniel turned the key over in his hand. But before ending the lease, he purchased the building. Everyone stared. He bought it? When? Nearly 9 years ago. I looked completely bewildered. He never told me. He wanted it to be a surprise. For what? Daniel reached into the wooden case again. This time he removed another envelope. Across the front were the words, "Open after responsibility is understood." I smiled despite myself. Another envelope. Helen laughed. I swear Charles bought stationery by the truckload. Even Brandon managed a small smile. I carefully opened it. Inside was another letter. If you are reading this, then I hope the first 3 boxes have already reminded everyone that inheritance isn't something we receive. It is something we continue. I continued reading. The workshop belongs to the family. Every face lifted. Not to be sold. Not to become an investment. Its purpose is to preserve local history, teach restoration, and provide scholarships for young people who wish to learn forgotten crafts. Rachel covered her mouth. He bought an entire building. For other people. Daniel nodded. He transferred ownership into a charitable trust. Brandon stared at the letter. I never knew. No one did, Daniel answered. Except me. The letter continued. If my family ever wishes to honor my memory, do not build statues. Restore something. Teach someone. Leave one more story than you found. I stopped reading for a moment. No one spoke. The room felt almost sacred. Then came the final paragraph. One day Lucas may be old enough to decide whether our family history continues. Lucas looked up immediately. Me, Charles continued, not because he is the youngest, but because every generation deserves the opportunity to choose service over ownership. Lucas's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know Grandpa believed in me. He always did, I whispered. Brandon quietly stood and walked to the window. For several moments, he stared into the snowy darkness outside. Finally, he spoke. I've spent 2 years wondering how much Dad left. He turned toward us. The truth is, he laughed softly through his tears. He left far more than I was ever capable of measuring. I walked over beside him. He did. I'm ashamed. I know. I almost reduced his entire life's work to auction estimates. You did. I don't know how to fix that. I placed my hand over his. You don't fix the past. What do I do? You honor it. He nodded slowly. How? I smiled. By becoming the kind of man your father believed you could still become. The room remained silent. Not because anyone felt uncomfortable, because every one of us understood something important. The workshop, the scholarships, the letters, the boxes. None of them had ever been designed to reveal hidden wealth. They had been carefully arranged to reveal hidden purpose. As everyone prepared to leave that evening, I noticed one last object resting at the bottom of the wooden case. A dark blue envelope, unlike every other one Charles had left. This envelope carried no instructions, only 3 handwritten words, for Brandon alone. My son noticed it at the same moment I did. He looked at me uncertainly. "I don't think I'm ready." I smiled gently. "You weren't ready before." He nodded. "And now?" I placed the envelope into his trembling hands. "I think your father believed you finally are." Brandon stared silently at his name, written in Charles's unmistakable handwriting. For several long seconds, he couldn't bring himself to break the seal. Brandon didn't open the envelope that night. He held it in both hands for several long moments, tracing the familiar strokes of his father's handwriting with his thumb. Then he slipped it carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket. "I need some time," he said quietly. No one argued. Charles had always believed that important words deserved an unhurried heart. The family slowly gathered coats and scarves. One by one they hugged me before leaving. There was a tenderness in those embraces that hadn't existed just a week earlier. It wasn't because every problem had been solved. It was because the pretending had ended. When the front door finally closed behind the last guest, I stood alone in Brandon's living room. The Christmas tree still glowed softly in the corner. Wrapping paper remained scattered beneath it. 3 empty coffee mugs sat forgotten on the dining table beside the carefully repacked boxes. Brandon walked back into the room. "Mom." "Yes." "Would you stay a little longer?" I smiled. "I'd like that." Rachel quietly took Lucas upstairs, sensing that father and son and mother needed privacy. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Brandon reached into his jacket and placed the blue envelope on the table. "I think Dad wanted you here when I read this." "I don't know." "I do." He took a slow breath. I've spent 2 years assuming things. I don't want to assume anymore." His hands trembled as he carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter spanning several pages. At the very top, Charles had written for my son Brandon. Brandon swallowed hard before beginning to read aloud. "My dear son, if this letter has reached your hands, then I suspect life has become more complicated than either of us hoped." Brandon's voice cracked almost immediately. He paused, collected himself, and continued. "Before you read another word, I need you to know something. I have never doubted that you love your family." Brandon stopped. He stared at the page. "I don't deserve this." I reached across the table and gently rested my hand over his. "Keep reading." He nodded. "You and I simply measure success differently. You learn to study numbers. I spent my life studying people. Neither approach is wrong, but one becomes dangerous when it forgets the other." Brandon wiped his eyes. Rachel had quietly returned to the doorway without either of us noticing. She stood silently listening. Brandon continued. "You have always wanted to provide for those you love. That is one of the reasons I have always been proud of you. But somewhere along the way, I noticed you becoming anxious whenever life couldn't be organized into financial outcomes. Please don't confuse security with meaning." The room remained perfectly still. Even the fire in the fireplace seemed quieter. Brandon kept reading. "If you are holding this letter, then perhaps you have already made decisions you regret. If so, welcome to being human." A faint, tearful laugh escaped Rachel. Charles always had a way of speaking without condemning. "Your mother will probably forgive you long before you forgive yourself." I smiled sadly. "He's right," I whispered. Brandon looked at me. "You already have. I forgave you before you apologized." His shoulders shook. "I don't understand." Because I knew grief was speaking louder than wisdom. Tears rolled freely down his face. "I thought I was helping." "I know. I honestly believed selling some of the collection could make life easier." "I know. I never wanted to erase Dad." "I know." Those same 3 words felt different this time. They weren't comforting him, they were setting him free. Brandon looked back at the letter. The next paragraph was underlined. There is one final responsibility I want to ask of you. Everyone instinctively leaned closer. The workshop on Maple Street belongs to the family trust. Legally, it can continue without you. But I hope it never has to. Brandon's breathing became uneven. If you truly wish to honor my life, do not become the owner. Become the caretaker. The sentence seemed to echo through the room. Not the owner, the caretaker. Brandon read the final page slowly. Every generation receives 3 gifts: the past, the present, the future. The foolish spend the past to improve the present. The wise preserve the past so the future becomes richer. Choose wisely, my son. The signature at the bottom simply read, "Love always, Dad." No elaborate farewell, no dramatic final words. Just, "Love always." For several minutes, Brandon couldn't speak. Neither could I. Finally, he folded the letter with extraordinary care, exactly as Charles always folded important papers. Then he surprised me. He walked over to the dining table where boxes 1, 2, and 3 rested, and placed his father's letter gently on top. He looked at me. "I don't want the workshop." I remained silent. "I don't want the antiques." Still I waited. "I don't even want to know what the remaining boxes contain until we've earned the right." A faint smile spread across Daniel's face. "You finally understand." Brandon nodded. "No." He looked around the room. "I'm finally beginning to." He turned toward Rachel. "I'm sorry." She embraced him without hesitation. "I know." Then he looked at Lucas. "I'm sorry to you too." Lucas smiled through his tears. "You can make it right." "I will." "How?" Brandon glanced toward the old wooden key Daniel had brought the day before. "Next Saturday." He looked at me. "If you're willing." "I'd like all of us to visit Grandpa's workshop." I smiled. "I'd love that. I want to restore it." Rachel looked surprised. "You mean renovate it?" He shook his head. "No." Then he repeated the sentence that had changed him forever. "I want to become its caretaker." Daniel quietly removed his glasses. Helen wiped away another tear. And as I looked at my son standing beneath the lights of the Christmas tree, I realized something extraordinary. Charles had never built those boxes to expose Brandon's worst qualities. He had built them patiently, one lesson at a time, to reveal the best man still waiting inside him. I looked toward the 3 numbered boxes resting peacefully on the table. There were still more waiting inside the storage unit. But somehow, I already knew the greatest treasure Charles had hoped to uncover had finally been found. It wasn't hidden in cardboard. It wasn't hidden in legal documents. It wasn't hidden in antiques. It had been hidden inside my son's heart. And at last, it had found its way home. The first Saturday in January dawned clear and cold. A fresh layer of snow covered Columbus, sparkling beneath a bright blue sky. For the first time since Charles's funeral, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Not relief, not happiness. Hope. At 9 o'clock sharp, Brandon pulled into my driveway. He climbed out of his truck carrying 2 thermoses of coffee. Lucas followed with a toolbox tucked beneath one arm. Rachel carried a box of homemade cinnamon rolls. Daniel and Helen arrived only minutes later. No one had been invited with formal phone calls. No one needed to be. Somehow Charles had gathered us one final time. Not around a dinner table, but around a purpose. Daniel handed Brandon the old brass key. "I think your father would want you to open the door." Brandon accepted it carefully. "I'll try not to let him down." "You already aren't." We drove together to the old brick workshop on Maple Street. Time had been kind to the building. Its windows were dusty. The paint had faded. The wooden sign above the entrance had weathered nearly white. Yet the structure itself remained solid, almost as though it had simply been waiting. Brandon inserted the brass key into the old lock. For a moment it refused to turn. Then with a soft click, the door opened. A faint scent of cedar machine oil and old wood drifted into the winter air. I closed my eyes. For one impossible second, I could almost hear Charles humming inside. The workshop looked exactly as he had left it. Workbenches stood neatly arranged. Hand tools hung in perfect rows. Glass cabinets displayed unfinished restoration projects. One wall was covered with framed photographs of antiques Charles had restored over the years. Rachel slowly walked through the room. "I can't believe he kept all this." Helen smiled. "He always said a workshop should tell stories before anyone even picked up a tool." Lucas wandered toward a long oak workbench. "Grandma!" I walked over. Resting on the bench was a wooden box, not cardboard, oak, handcrafted. Its brass plate simply read, "For whoever opens the door." Brandon looked at me. "I think this belongs to all of us." I nodded. Together we lifted the lid. Inside rested only three things: Charles's old leather work gloves, a fountain pen, a final letter. I unfolded it slowly. The handwriting immediately brought tears to my eyes. "If you are standing inside this workshop, then my greatest hope has already come true." Everyone gathered around. That hope was never that someone would inherit my collection. It was that someone would continue my purpose. I looked toward Brandon. He stood perfectly still. "If you have reached this room together, then you have already protected something far more valuable than antiques. You have protected one another." The silence inside the workshop felt almost sacred. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently past the windows. I continued reading. Every restored object teaches the same lesson. Damage is not always the end of the story. Rachel quietly wiped away another tear. Charles wrote, "Sometimes cracks become the reason something survives another 100 years." Helen smiled through her tears. "He actually believed that." "So do I whispered. The next paragraph felt almost like Charles was speaking directly to Brandon. "My son, if you are here, thank you." Brandon covered his mouth. "You do not need to become the man I was. Become the man only you can be. Just remember that whatever success you build, leave room inside it for kindness." Brandon lowered his head. "I will, Dad." His voice barely rose above a whisper. The final page contained only a few sentences. "Marlene, thank you for believing people can still grow. You were always the wiser half of this marriage." I laughed through my tears. "You always said that." Daniel chuckled softly. He said it to everyone. The very last line filled the room with a quiet peace. "When people ask what became of my collection, tell them it became a family again." I couldn't continue for several seconds. No one hurried me. Finally, I folded the letter and looked around the workshop. Brandon walked slowly toward one of the old workbenches. He picked up Charles's worn leather gloves. Then, instead of putting them on, he carefully placed them back exactly where they had rested. "They stay here," he said. "Why?" Lucas asked. "So every student who learns here remembers whose hands built this place." Lucas smiled. "I like that." "So do I." Over the following months, the workshop slowly came back to life. Local volunteers helped repaint the walls. Retired craftsmen offered free restoration classes. The first Ashford Heritage Scholarship welcomed two young students interested in museum conservation. Helen returned once a week to teach furniture restoration. Daniel donated historical legal documents for educational exhibits. Rachel organized community open houses. Lucas spent every Saturday cataloging family photographs and recording the stories behind them. And Brandon, he surprised everyone, including himself. He reduced his hours at work, not because he needed less money, because he wanted more time. More time with family. More time mentoring scholarship students. More time restoring broken furniture beside his son. One afternoon, nearly a year later, I watched Brandon patiently teaching Lucas how to repair an old rocking chair. Their heads bent together exactly the way Charles and Brandon's once had. For a moment, time folded in on itself. The little boy who had once drawn crooked Christmas trees had become a father teaching patience instead of profit. I quietly smiled. Charles had been right all along. The greatest inheritance was never hidden inside the boxes. It wasn't the medals, it wasn't the photographs, it wasn't the workshop, it wasn't even the antiques. The greatest inheritance was the opportunity to become better than we were yesterday. As I locked the workshop that evening, I glanced back one last time. The shelves no longer looked like a museum. They looked alive, filled with laughter, conversation, purpose, family. And I finally understood why Charles never called any of it a collection.